This is the House Judiciary Non Civil Committee meeting. We have 4 bills on the agenda. We have a limited amount of time, so we're going to give extra points for brevity. Chairman Dollar, we'll go ahead and call you for House Bill 917.
Okay, we're good. H. Bill 917 is simply a modernization to our copyright law for things such as music and film, movies. Currently, it's things, traditional things that you might imagine, like videotapes, CDs, records, cassettes, and it simply updates it to digital formats such as memory cards, flash drives, hard drives, and data storage devices. As you may imagine, this is, in today's age, this is the way that content is pirated and distributed, and all it does is just update that language.
So this is basically an update to our piracy law to reflect current technology, as opposed to when the law was originally written, which had no contemplation of thumb drives, etc.
You're exactly right. It's covered under federal law, but not state law.
Okay. Let me get a report from the subcommittee chair, Chairman Sessler.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. It is, on its face, a very straightforward bill. There was one thing that came up in subcommittee that we removed out of an abundance of caution. I don't know that it was essential to the bill. I think the gentleman did a little more research on that, and we felt like if something needed to be added back in, we could perhaps consider it here, but I don't think it's needed to move this forward. Is that correct?
That's correct. This is the more important portion of the bill. There were 5 words that were in question.
Mm-hmm.
I think that it's agreed that the idea of what those Chairman Reeves pointed out that they were, Leg Council concluded that if we wanted to move forward with it, we just needed a cleaner way to say it.
True.
Yep.
So, Mr. Chairman, this moved forward unanimously from subcommittee with a due pass recommendation.
Okay. Questions for the author? Questions for the author? Seeing none, what's the pleasure of the committee?
Move due pass.
Vice Chair moves due pass of House Bill 917 by substitute LC 297978S, second by Representative Silcox. Are there any amendments? Are there any amendments? Seeing none, all in favor of the gentleman's motion, signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Opposed? The ayes have it. The motion is adopted. Thank you, Chairman.
Thank you,
Dollar.
Chairman.
All right. Chairman Welch. Chairman Welch has House Bill 623.
Good morning, Mr. Chairman, members of the committee. It's a privilege to be here. Very quickly, this the legislation 623 before you this morning really just fills in a gap between criminal background checks for our state employees. It is a voluntary program, but it would authorize the GBI to maintain a database of fingerprints of employees and contractors in the state. It does not. It is voluntary. Each department, even local governments, could choose to use this. RAPBAC that's what we call it, as a RAPBAC program. It ties into a federal NCIC and the GCIC database. It also will connect with other state databases to ensure that for non-criminal justice purposes, employment or licensing with state agencies, there'll be a notification that comes back of any criminal activity of employee or a licensor or a permittee that under state law, if they've had a criminal hit in some other jurisdiction, then that will notify the agency that's overseeing the contract, the license, or the employment of individuals. Right now, we just simply take a background check as a snapshot in time, and then until it's renewed, relicensed, we don't know the criminal background of that individual. So if something were to happen, someone that's enrolled in the system were to engage in criminal activity in another state, we would not know that until the next background check. And this would fill that gap, and again, it is not mandatory. It just authorizes the GBI to maintain the system. Then it would be up to each department to decide whether they would enter into or subscribe to that system. That's the bill.
And I'll get a report from the subcommittee chair. Can you speak to the security aspect of the database? And
Yes, sir.
because I know in past years when we've gone through this as relates to prescriptions and so forth, there's always been that issue, and rightly so. So if you could
That's correct.
touch on that.
This is a separate and distinct database. It is not to be, the statute specifically identifies that it must be secure and separate from the criminal database. So the law requires that of GBI to maintain in that fashion.
Okay, let's get a report from subcommittee chair, Chairman Setzler.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The chair did touch on some things that were touched on in committee. I mean, I think the policy behind this is a fair question. If we by statute designate certain positions in state government or positions for which we have oversight as needing a criminal background check before permission to hire or grant a license is required, is there not a need to manage is there not an interest moving forward that while they're in that role, if they were involved in some criminal activity, not just in the state but nationally, we would have knowledge of that? I think that was the policy question before us. And I think that's a fair policy question. I think the subcommittee was comfortable that if we by statute, and every one of these roles requires statutory provision to mandate fingerprints. This does not delegate agencies the power to decide who gets fingerprinted, but for those things for which we have designated a requirement to fingerprint, this would just allow us to manage while they're in that job or in that position of responsibility. We could maintain sort of real-time tracking if they were involved. And I think as we talked about the federal concerns, it is a fair question. But I think we wouldn't want to be in a position where you only could see what was happening inside the state of Georgia. I do think to the extent there's an interest in fingerprint checks for people in positions of responsibility, we ought to have a national look. That was ultimately what I think was convincing to the subcommittee, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Chairman Setzler. Questions, members of the committee? Ms. Gonzalez.
Thank you, Chairman. Thank you, Chairman Setzler. I still want to voice some concern that I have. I did talk a little bit about it in subcommittee, but I want to bring it up again as I reviewed the bill over the weekend and some other issues. My biggest concern is not what's happening here at the state level. And from my understanding, biometric data is not really a type of data that we tend to keep because of the high risk that it has in terms of privacy. And so the first part of the bill I'm okay with what we're doing here in Georgia. My biggest concern comes that this bill also authorizes us to give this information to the FBI. And my understanding is that the FBI will collect fingerprints of those who are criminals or those who are convicted of a crime. And what I don't want to see is that the vast majority of these individuals who are being fingerprinted right now are not criminals. They are not being charged with a crime. And I don't want them put into a database that then gives them the same treatment that criminals would be. And so that's my biggest concern about what happens with these fingerprints once they're there. One, from the privacy standpoint, but two, from the security standpoint. I mean, it is common best practices right now in the security industries. And I say this as an author of a book that deals with managing online risk, that this is data that we are very careful about keeping because of the high risk once that data is leaked. Thank you.
Let me ask, I see Chairman Setzler's light flashing, but did the author want to speak to that at all?
Yes, we took in testimony, or the subcommittee took in testimony from GBI and the RATBAP program is a federal program. So this is a top-down program that is offered to the states. The FBI maintains a separate non-criminal justice database for fingerprints, so that it would be the same system that we're dealing with in the state of Georgia, separate and secure from the criminal background check, and then it would allow for the running of a fingerprint once there's been a criminal hit that would send that back to the state. So it's separate, it's distinct. This is a program that the federal government is authorizing and mandates that it be separate and distinct from the criminal background database, our GCIC database.
So it is not integrated?
It's not integrated, but what happens is if you are picked up for a fingerprint check, so you have a hit into the NCIC system, then that will relay information back to the wrap back system. And if there is a similar fingerprint there, the same fingerprint there, then that will send a message to GBI, and GBI then can notify the agency for which that individual is employed. So if it's a high school, if it's a DFAX worker, if it's a teacher in a high school that comes up with a child molestation hit in another jurisdiction, then we would be notified as to that. As it is right now, we would not. We would have to wait until there was another cycle of renewed licensing. So there could be as long as 1 year, to as long as 3 years, to as long as 5 years before we would ever find out the background, unless the employee voluntarily notified his employer or licensor. And so we would know there'd be prolonged periods of time where people who are vulnerable could be subject to this particular individual. And that's to Chairman Setzler's point. If we think it's important to know someone's background before we hire them, then do we not also have a heightened standard of duty to know while they're in a position of responsibility, while they have a license, while they're overseen and we've placed them, we've authorized them to be in a place where there is need for security in banks and banking, handling your driver's license information, watching over our children or our elderly, do we not have an affirmative duty to ensure that every day that they're in that position, they are not engaging in other crimes that would undermine that authority or jeopardize the people over which they're supposed to be being responsible for? And I think the answer in my mind is yes, we should. And this system is available to us. It is mandated that it's separate and distinct. And so I brought the bill before you.
Any questions from members of the committee of the author? Ms. Gonzalez.
Is the FBI database also kept separate, or once it goes to the FBI, is it all put into the one database?
It's a separate database from the NCIC database.
So when it goes from the GBI to the FBI, it will be put into a separate database?
Yes, that's my understanding, is that they're absolutely separate. Federal law requires that those databases, non-criminal fingerprinting or biometrics, would be kept separate from the criminal database.
And I want it on record that I agree with the purpose and the goal of this bill. I'm just very concerned, without any restrictions or conditions, what happens to that data once it gets to the FBI?
Yes, I can appreciate that concern.
Chairman Setzler.
Mr. Chairman, I'm going speaking as a member of the committee, I'm going to speak out of the other side of my mouth. I do think this is the right policy for us. However, I do, for purposes of full disclosure, I think we do need to ask the question, as we looked at this, Chairman Welch was very forthcoming with a list of all the different jobs and roles and licensed positions that require fingerprinting. I think that the lady's question is well taken from my perspective. You know, we probably need to relook all the different positions that require this. There may be things we need to add. There may be things we would want to take away. There's nothing that I saw that troubled me on its face. But the policy question is really, we've provided in statute these positions will be fingerprinted. And if there's concerns about who we're fingerprinting, maybe we need to revisit that in another measure. But to the extent we think something should be fingerprinted, to the gentleman's point, the suggestion we shouldn't manage that moving forward, I think is I think just candidly amiss. I would also say, Mr. Chairman, to the lady's point, I think we can all assume as state policymakers, if a biometric or information goes to the federal government, whether it's in one database or another, I think we need to assume it's not going to ever get washed clean. That's just my opinion. I think if there was some suggestion by the FBI, oh yeah, we'll get rid of it someday, I don't think we can assume that's true. I think we need to expect, looking at all the powers the federal government has from Department of Justice, Homeland Security, Department of Defense side, I think we've got to assume it's going to stay there. But I think if we're going to take the policy as a state, Mr. Chairman, I'm speaking just as members of this committee, that we need to fingerprint somebody before they get a license. I think managing that moving forward while they're in that role is persuasive to me that we ought to do this.
All right. Any further questions for the author? Seeing none, what's the pleasure of the committee? Mr. Gravely moves due pass of House Bill 623 by substitute, LC 297889S, second by the Vice Chair. Are there any amendments? Seeing none, any further discussion? Seeing none, all in favor of the gentleman's motion signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Opposed? The ayes have it. The motion is adopted. Thank you, Chairman Welch. Let's move to House Bill 764. Representative Clark. Is Representative Clark here? Did you say he's in the hall? Chairman Welch, if you see Representative Clark, can you tell him to come on? Oh, okay, thank you. There he is. All right, Representative Clark, you've got HB 764, and we're looking at substitute LC 297974S.
Thank you, Chairman. Thank you to the committee members. House Bill 764, and just want to say thanks to the subcommittee for helping me work on my bill and passing it through here to the full committee. Was happy with having the PTSD on there. Was a little down about the chronic pain being taken out, and just wanted to say one thing a little bit about being down. A little bit about that is we have 3,500 patients who are on it currently, and I know from day one there's been a pushback, a stigma on if we needed this CBD oil at all. And we've seen every time we pass a condition, it's helping Georgians live a better life. We've had no safety concerns. We've had no health scares at all. We've had no deaths. But then we see we continue to have the whole epidemic that's going on right now with the opioid epidemic. You know, from 2010 and now we've seen a double in the deaths. We've seen 5 times the deaths since 1999. It's just huge. We also see, you know, it's about the opioid crisis is costing the nation $500 billion each year. We're seeing just from the whole effects of what's happening. We're seeing the foster care system is overflowing with children whose parents, you know, don't care for them. Coroner's offices are overwhelmed with bodies, and ambulance services are straining small town budgets. And that was from a big think tank who's just researching and following all the statistics on that. So I think that was one thing that I was a little bit down about, because I know we can save lives. I know it will save lives. And so for that, I was a little bit down because I saw it. We've seen states that have passed it, 25% reduction in opioids. That means lives being saved directly. That means lives directly here in Georgia that could be saved. So I was a little bit down about that because, I mean, I believe 100% that if we do it right, and Georgia's doing it right so far with how we're handling the conditions, how we're handling the registry, you know, that we can be the generation that helps do a huge step forward and stopping this epidemic of opioids. So that was a little disheartening, but excited about the PTSD, and I know that's going to help a lot of Americans who are struggling with that to live better lives. So with that, I'm excited, and we're glad to answer any questions from the full committee on the bill that we have that I have before you.
Yeah, I mean, there is an argument to be made. I mean, obviously, with some conditions that we've considered both in the past and in the present and future, that some conditions would certainly increase the amount of usage by a startling amount. It would shoot the arrow straight up in terms of overall usage, chronic pain, and certainly chronic pain would be probably the one condition that would result in the highest percentage leap. But the counter to that, of course, is the fact that we are talking about an oil. We're not talking about anything else but the oil. albeit with a potentially high, very high THC. But by the same token, to the gentleman's point, which is very well taken, and it's a point the chair's made in the past, just ruminating aloud, that if we have faith in our system, if we have faith in the process that was put into place a few years ago, and to the gentleman's point, we haven't had any real problems that I'm aware of, and I would think I'd be informed of those fairly quickly if there were. If we have faith in that process, query as to why we would have any limitations at all. If there are professionals who are making that determination as to who's on the registry and who's not. Just a thought. Report from the subcommittee chair, Mr. Setzler.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. This was a vigorous debate in subcommittee, and I think at the end of the day, the subcommittee was prevailed upon by the author that there could be post-traumatic stress conditions, whether it's in a military setting or other traumatic events that happened in childhood or even adulthood, and that's really captured here in lines 12 through 13. There was even a study of the DSM-5, what the diagnostic criteria were for that, and I think we've landed on a good solid balance that addresses that which people believe PTSD to be. I think the policy question was one of a recognition that in the 10 plus states that had a medical cannabis structure before full legalization or recreational legalization or otherwise, or still have medical cannabis. In medical cannabis states, 93% on average. It ranged between 88% and 96%, but 93% on average of all prescriptions were for one diagnosis, and that one diagnosis was chronic pain. I know anecdotally, myself, I have friends who live there whose kids had chronic pain cards in states that have this structure, and it was purely for recreational use. So I think the concern was well-founded, and I think the committee acted in a way that addresses, I think, something that matters very much to the author, which is that PTSD be a mechanism that we would support consistent with the limitations we've had in the past. But I think the discussion of chronic pain would be a dramatic departure from the limited approach we've taken for medical cannabis for enumerated specific purposes as opposed to broad, really wide open purposes. Mr. Chairman, it was on that basis the subcommittee moved forward this LC version.
Okay, questions from members of the committee, Mr. Bodie.
To the author, thank you for bringing this. This is very important. I think this is vital. Now, being that you're using the PTSD language, this is also in certain settings can help our military veterans. Is that correct?
That's correct.
Okay, and it's also going to help foster kids and anyone else that may have been through a traumatic experience like a rape victim, child molestation, anything, right? Is that pretty much the umbrella we're focusing on?
That is correct, and as long as it falls through when they go to a professional of PTSD and all that.
Okay. So the diagnosis is good enough. Okay.
Yep.
Thank you so much, Mr. Chair.
Any further questions, members of the committee? Seeing none, what's the pleasure of the committee? Well, we got to get a motion first. That's okay. Mr. Gravely moves due pass of HB 764 LC 297974S. Is there a second? Second by Mr. Bodie. Are there any amendments? Ms. Silcox.
Yes, I'd like to propose an amendment that this would not apply to folks that are 18 or less. Because we know from neuroscience that people's brains are still growing, and my concern would be that their brainstem would be shrunk while they're still developing as a child and having to take a lot of tests and hopefully get into college.
While I'm gonna call on the author for a reaction to that amendment, while I'm doing that and while he's doing that, if you could fashion some language
Okay.
to
I would say,
allow that to go forward, Mr. Clark.
Open, to adding more definition into it of who can use it and who cannot. I just think, there'll always any medication you take, there can always be a side effect, but I know from all the research, and since the beginning of time that, humans have used the cannabis and all that. We don't see anything, really of side effects that really have, serious side effects. And I think if you go look at other drugs, I mean, you go into, and this is not on the same line, medication, but even Ritalin. I mean, there was a huge study done, and that was done following kids who were on it, who not get off before 12. This was back when it first came out. Just showed you that when they followed these boys all through it, all the way to 25, they did not get off by age 12. That over 70% of them were in prison on drugs or dead. And so I think there's always a little, there can always be a side effect of something. There can always be something that you could say, hey, maybe it's some negative thing to it. And I know there's that one little negative thing you can say, okay, it might hurt their brain development. But I think if they've gone through something so terrible, so bad, they need some type of medication. Is this worse than another medication that has a whole huge list of side effects? I believe, and you might have a specific medication that you're talking about that you think they should be on instead of the cannabis oil. But I'm pretty sure on the back the side effects would line up worse than the cannabis oil. And I'm open to being wrong. I'm not an expert that says I'm right no matter what. But I just feel like the outcome and what it can do if they really do need it is better than a lot of times. And again, that goes to the medical professional who would say, hey, no, you know what? You need to be on something else instead of this. But if they think they should be, and also, the thing about it too is if they're under 18, they have parents who also have a choice to help them decide what's best for the kid. So I kind of believe with that, I think we have enough things, precautions to make sure that the child gets what's best for them.
Mr. Gravely.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I don't have a problem with the amendment. I would urge the committee to realize that we are seeing drastic positive results from the use of low THC cannabis oil in patients who were suffering seizures, oftentimes up from 40 to 100 a day, who have now come off of opioids, where we had physicians testify that in many of these cases the opioid prescriptions were that of adult doses, which should not have been prescribed to these kids to begin with. So they've actually come off of something that was and is proven to be detrimental to their development, and they are now on something, and we've not seen any negative result. However, due to the post-traumatic stress and the target audience we are trying to help here, wouldn't see a problem with the amendment.
Mr. Bodie.
To the author, you stated earlier that one of the
Yeah, pull the microphone to
I'm
you.
sorry. You stated earlier that one of the target audiences or target patients were foster care children. Is that not correct? And that by possibly limiting it to the age of 18 with the amendment, I totally respect the representatives and my colleagues' concern, but that would definitely dramatically probably pretty much take that whole category of potential patients out of the equation with that particular amendment. Is that correct?
I think it would, but then I totally respect
Yeah.
my colleague's amendment and her concerns, because I know all of us have great hearts. We all want to help out everybody and do the right thing. I do think I think we've seen from a number of the conditions that we have passed have been used and hugely positive results on kids, and they're doing great. So I mean, again, there's always a side effect, but we see, with the seizures and other conditions, it's been positive. They're doing great. So I know if anything, there's always a side effect. There is no perfect anything in this world besides Jesus.
Ms. Price.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm concerned about leaving even this post-traumatic stress disorder in the bill. I was supportive of it in subcommittee only because we were able to strike the chronic pain from it, but at this point, I'm not comfortable with the post-traumatic stress disorder either, in that the diagnosis, according to the DSM, is quite broad, and I'm afraid could be abused, and also have to take exception to the comment about opioids and seizures, because that's really not a use of that drug in that condition. In fact, it can elicit seizures. So I think we have to be very careful with our science as we're talking about these things. So I'm opposed to the bill, but I support the amendment.
Okay, any further discussion on the amendment? Yes. Press your button. There you go. Ms. Gonzalez.
My only concern with that amendment is that maybe it is too broad, and it would mean that there is a significant amount of a target audience that we want to help is not getting there. Would you consider sort of putting a condition on that amendment that instead of saying and just outright prohibiting of any minor under the age of 18, that for any minor under the age of 18, that it cannot exceed a certain amount?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I think the very difficult thing about this is that on a federal level, marijuana and cannabis oil and all cannabis is still categorized as a Schedule I drug. And so I don't think that the studies have been there. My contention with this entire issue has been that we really need definitive studies. And I would urge the federal government to move it to a Schedule II drug, study it, let us know what it does to everybody, not just children. But we do know definitively from neuroscience that people's brains are not developed, arguably until even older, until 21, 22 years old. But recognizing that there are veterans that may be suffering from PTSD that have served our country as young as 18 or 19 years old, that's why I would suggest that we keep the amendment at 18.
All right. We're running short on time. We've got one more bill to do. I think we are going to go over 10 o'clock just for planning purposes. Hopefully not much longer than that. The House will go in at 10, although this time of year tends to be more like 10:10, 10:15 from experience. So with that, we have a motion. We have a second. We have an amendment proposed by Representative Silcox. Representative Silcox, let me ask you to read your amendment and where it would go and such.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chairman. On line 13, after the word trauma, if we could remove the period and ask for a person who is at least 18 years of age.
Okay.
Oh, for a patient, excuse me, for a patient who is at least 18 years of age.
Okay. Everybody clear on the wording of the amendment? Mr. Gravely?
This amendment applies only to the PTSD.
Correct.
Okay.
All right. All in so the net effect of the amendment is to limit it as it relates to PTSD to individuals over 18 years of age. All in favor of the ladies' amendment signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Opposed?
Nay.
In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it. Is there doubt? There is doubt. All in favor of the ladies' amendment signify by raising your hand. 1, 2, 3. I'm sorry. Opposed? The amendment carries. Are there any further amendments? Are there any further amendments? Mr. Gravely?
Yes, sir, Mr. Chairman. I have an amendment. I'll pass out to the committee. There you go, if you'll pass that down. Mr. Chairman, over the weekend, evaluating both the testimony and subcommittee, where and my chairman, who acknowledged that there are, when chronic pain is added as an eligible diagnosis, that there appears to be a spike in those that would register to try and claim that there was a pseudo chronic pain or whatnot. I believe that spike happens in medical marijuana states, but also I think there's an additional recreational component You know, just with full transparency, I have some friends that have it in chronic pain, and I think they'd rather smoke marijuana than take a low THC CBD oil. I think what we want to do is try and get to those people who truly are suffering from a pain that cannot be managed, it cannot be controlled. So taking into consideration the caution, looked around to different states. Intractable pain is a eligible diagnosis in Minnesota. I had the pleasure of traveling to Minnesota with my colleague, Representative Peake, 2 years ago. They have an incredible system up there. They are not a recreational state. They allow only for medical use, and neither do they have smoking in that state as a medical prescription. So I would like to submit upon actual review of the fact that for the past 4 years, we have not been able to satisfy the governor in having PTSD and chronic pain on previous bills, but I believe the governor's trepidation and maybe even some of his questions have been answered due to the consistency of our registry, to the protocol in which we as this body have put on those who would apply for medical cannabis oil. So I would like to actually add intractable pain under, create a line, I guess 14, put after O, put P. And those of you, if I need to read the amendment, or those of you who have it in front of you, I believe this tightens it up a little bit. It's very specific. It's not a loose definition. This is actual this is the definition from Minnesota on what they have as intractable pain, and I believe it will accomplish being able to help those in our state who need the help. Intractable actually, as defined, is hard to control or deal with, would be unmanageable, uncomfortable, difficult, awkward, troublesome, demanding, and burdensome. Mr. Chairman, I would like to submit this amendment.
Let me get council's thoughts on the wording.
So my suggestion would be that if you are inclined to add this condition, that you would just add the condition of a new subparagraph P, intractable pain. But in the list of definitions, you would define intractable pain as most of the words that Representative Bradley has here. So intractable pain would be between lines 13 and 14. And then in the appropriate alphabetical order in the code section itself, it would say intractable pain means pain which has a cause that cannot be removed, and the remainder of his language.
Is that clear to members of the committee? We just go ahead and list it out as P, and then it would be a defined term in a section above.
Yes, sir.
Okay.
I want to make sure, Mr. Chairman, if I may, we have on there for a period of at least 6 months that these individuals who would make application to the registry have been to their treating physician, they have been prescribed other medication, and it just does not seem to be doing anything for the condition, or has had some type of intolerable side effect.
All right. Discussion on the amendment. Let's try to keep our comments very brief, please. Ms. Price.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. In my professional opinion, there's no difference in intractable pain and chronic pain, which we voted down last week.
Mr. Bodie.
This is to Representative Gravely. Would this also be okay if the doctor lists that this is all alternative to opioid medications after 6 months? Would that be okay definition? Because I love the amendment, but I just want to make sure if that's okay as an alternative to opioids after 6 months as well.
Well, I don't know if this answers your question. In the amendment, it says, according to generally accepted medical practice, the full range of pain management modalities appropriate for this patient. So that I would assume what we're trying to do here is the definition would have taken into consideration that there would have been prescriptions, there would have been consultation and the use of opioids or pain medicine to address this particular diagnosis or.
Mr. Setzler. Okay.
Mr. Chairman, this is a similar amendment was offered in subcommittee and not adopted. I would just urge the committee to move forward. PTSD is an option, but without this proposal.
Any further discussion on the amendment? Seeing none, we've laid it out in proper context. It'll be listed as P, perhaps even subsection P, or it would be a line 14 beginning with P, and then it'd be a defined term as defined here by Representative Gravely in his proposed amendment in a section above as per council's description. All in favor of the gentleman's motion signify by raising your hand. 1, 2, 3, 4. Opposed? 1, 2, 3, 4. The ayes are 4, the nays are 4. The chair votes aye, and the amendment is adopted. Are there any further amendments? Seeing none, all in favor of the underlying motion of do pass by substitute, LC 7974S, including the Gravely amendment, signify by saying aye. Aye. Opposed?
No.
Chair is in doubt. All in favor of the underlying motion of do pass by substitute, including the Gravely amendment, please signify by raising your hand. 1, 2, 3, 4. Opposed? 1, 2, 3. You can only vote once. It's in the rule book, guys. I promise you. Let's do this again. All in favor of the underlying motion of do pass by substitute of LC 7974S, including the Gravely amendment, signify by raising your hand. 1, 2, 3. Opposed? The ayes are 4, the nays are 4. The chair votes aye, and the motion is adopted. Thank you, Mr. Clark.
Thank you, Chairman.
Let's continue right away to House Bill 605. Representative Spencer is still in South Georgia. He had an emergency at his employment. He was down a doctor and he's down a nurse, and so therefore, in his words, he's it. So under the category of supporting rural health care, he's exactly where he needs to be. Representative Reeves, Vice Chairman Reeves, has graciously agreed to carry the bill for purposes of this committee in terms of presentation, and of course he'll work in his subcommittee chair report as well as part of his presentation, and then we'll hopefully move expeditiously to a motion, Mr. Vice Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and my hope is to move very quickly too. This is, I'm happy to sit in for Representative Spencer on this bill today. I have worked extraordinarily close with him for the last several weeks on this issue, and I know that the faces in the audience right now are all familiar on this issue. We've spent a lot of time together, and this is probably perhaps the, if not the most, one of the most difficult issues that have come through my subcommittee and perhaps this committee in the last few years. But I also want to say that it is perhaps one of the most meaningful pieces of legislation that have come through this committee since I have been here. It has taken a tremendous amount of work, debate, discussion, back and forth, drawing up, redrawing, to get where we are now. And I want to make clear that what we have learned through the work of Representative Spencer is that the timeliness of this issue is understood. We all are reading in the news and hearing in the news about these horrible instances of sexual abuse and then institutional cover-up of these. And it's as sickening as anything that I can think of. I don't know that I can come up with anything that's more sickening than this. And through the work of Representative Spencer previously in previous years, and through the work of the legal community and through the courage of victims of horrible sexual abuse, there's a lot that's come to light in the reality of this sexual abuse and the institutional cover-up. And so with that, we have learned that there are a group of people, a group of Georgians, a group of residents, but really a group of human beings who essentially have been left voiceless with the ability to make a claim for the horrible things that have happened to them. And everybody that's been on the subcommittee is very familiar with this issue, but there is a long-standing in the tort law of fraud, the tort of fraud tolls the statute of limitations, meaning that until the victim discovers that fraud has been committed, that statute of limitations does not run. And that is an extraordinary remedy in our law, the tolling of a statute of limitations. And the fact is that with these type cases that have come to light and that we have been working through, what we've learned is that in a lot of these fact patterns, the elements of fraud aren't met because of just case-specific reasons. The elements being that a false misrepresentation was made and that there was a detrimental reliance. And so therefore, there are victims in the state of Georgia who are unable to take advantage of the extraordinary remedy that the fraud statute offers by tolling the statute so that they can make a case years later. And so what we have sought to do is to do something that is quite frankly extraordinary. And in doing this, we have tried to be extremely mindful of following the precedent that we have as closely as possible and as applicable as possible in creating a pathway for victims of sexual abuse where the entity that they were under the care of concealed or covered up this abuse. And so we have created a new tolling mechanism that not only will be applicable moving forward, but also goes back in time and allows these victims another way to be able to make a claim. I acknowledge that this may not work for every single person who is seeking a remedy. And I acknowledge that these fact patterns are all different. Our duty on this committee and as members of the General Assembly is to be as diligent as we can and be as thoughtful as we can in trying to balance what are some very difficult issues, but also measuring precedent and coming up with a way of changing the law in such a way that it's going to work, and hopefully it works for most of the people that need this help, that need this voice, and need this remedy. So very quickly, the first part of the bill I'm going to very quickly discuss. The currently existing Hidden Predator Act allows a person to make a claim up until they're 23 years of age. And then it also allows that person, if they discover later on in life that they were the victim of sexual abuse, it gives them a 2-year window in order to be able to make a claim if that discovery doesn't happen until later. Quite simply put, Representative Spencer's bill in the first part moves that age from 23 to age 38, and it changes that discovery window from 2 years to 4 years, thus extending the statute of limitations in which a person can make a claim. And there's been exhaustive testimony about the necessity of that, and that delayed outcry and delayed realization in some cases is just a reality that goes with this type of the psychology with the folks that have experienced this type of abuse. I want to talk now about Section 3, which begins on line 56. This has been where the work of the committee has focused. And if we can go ahead and move to page 3, I just want to get right to line 67. Lines 67 through 76 is the section of this bill that creates a new tolling of the statute of limitations that works backwards. Again, I think that everybody on this committee recognizes, and I think everybody in the room recognizes how extraordinary this remedy, what we are offering here, how extraordinary this is. And it is my deepest belief that this has to be offered in a measured way. And so what we have done is that basically for all victims whose statute of limitations essentially would have run, they would have the chance to make a claim against an entity from years past if they basically can prove a set of elements that includes, number one, that the entity had a responsibility of care for the plaintiff. Number two, that the entity knew or should have known of the alleged conduct that gave rise to the action, or that they knew or should have known of the sexual abuse. And number three, that the entity intentionally or with conscious indifference concealed evidence of such conduct. Further, as far as damages, we have included a provision to state that damages may be awarded if the plaintiff proves by clear and convincing evidence that such entity intentionally or with conscious indifference concealed evidence of such conduct. So that is for claims of the past. This was very, very carefully worked out. I can't begin to explain the number of hours that have gone into this. So really quickly moving to line 77, moving forward from what would be July 1st of 2019 and then on into the future, the elements that a person would need to be able to prove would be, number one, that there was a duty of care, that a responsibility of care that the entity had to the plaintiff, and that the plaintiff discovered that evidence that the entity intentionally or with conscious indifference concealed evidence of the sexual abuse. So the standard is less moving forward than it is going backwards, and that is with reason. Number one, this is 2018, and everyone is aware, every entity, business, organization that has the responsibility of minors is aware of the significance of this issue. And so we feel that the standard is appropriate moving forward to be slightly less than the standard moving backwards. And the standard moving backwards is set up the way that it is because, and I know there's debate, but it's my belief and many others' beliefs that these cases are not going to be dismissed at a motion to dismiss level, that they will be able to survive if those basic elements can be pled and discovery will take place. But that standard, in fairness, because of the age of some of these cases, that standard needs to be set out a little bit differently than the standard moving forward. And so that is that's the explanation of what's in front of you, and I'll be happy to stand for questions or discussion.
Thank you. I want to thank the vice chair, especially for his work over the weekend. He and I spent, and council as well, Ms. Travis, spent far too much quality time over the weekend on this, but it was time well spent on an issue that I think the vice chair was quoted in a previous media report as saying, doing nothing is not an option, and I agree with that. But it does have to be tempered, as the vice chair described, especially given the fact that we are talking about going back and the precedent that sets. It's not a new precedent. We have done that in the past. We did that a few years ago. But we are expanding on that slightly, very narrowly, but with a straight face that does allow for a path. And yes, there will be factual situations that will ultimately not be able to carry forward with this framework, and there will be others that will. But just as any other case, especially cases like these, are very fact-specific. There will be a path for some. There will not be a path for others. This compromise, which is a very, very delicate balance, will mean different things for different situations. We can't obviously legislate for particular results. All we can do is go ahead and set up a clear and fair and rational framework and process depending on the public policy priority that we're talking about. If we were not talking about childhood sexual abuse, we would not be in this meeting right now. That is a guarantee. And I think we all know that. I think we all know that. But given the nature of the facts involved, of the issue involved, it goes back to the vice chair's comment that doing nothing is not an option, but to do so in a very measured manner. There's also, it's the conflict members between, well, not the conflict, but it's the marriage, for lack of a better term, of your heart and your head. And in terms, I can only describe that as far as I'm concerned. This is a bill from a heart standpoint where I believe it needs to go forward. But from a head standpoint, from what's in my head, I also understand I believe I understand, based on the conversations that I've had on a nearly daily basis, as to what can potentially get to the floor for a vote. That is a very delicate walk of the tightrope, frankly, as I've come to discover. I believe this substitute that you have in front of you, while imperfect and frankly incomplete, there will be other issues, should this measure go to the House, pass, and go to the Senate, that will need to be addressed in the other body. We just simply did not have the time to address absolutely everything. But it does represent, I believe, a balanced, measured, well thought out proposal for your consideration that is a very, very special circumstance given the subject matter that we are discussing here. I want to just add that to the vice chair's comment. Again, I appreciate all of his time, Chairman Setzler's time, and Ms. Travis's time over the weekend. Mr. Setzler.
Mr. Chairman, I think to add to what the vice chair said, it's a very special circumstance. It is not unique, though. It is intended to parallel fraud and be equal to a fraud structure. There's a mechanism where there's an intentional deception. Our current law provides a tolling of the statute. This creates a circumstance where if there's an intentional concealment, which is more the nature of the subject matter.
Thank you. Questions for the quasi-author, sponsor, vice chair, in place of Representative Spencer, who's doing good work right now? Questions for Mr. Reeves or myself? Seeing none, what's the pleasure of the committee? Mr. Reeves moves due pass of House Bill 605 by substitute. Make sure I've got the LC 297982S, second by Ms. Silcox. Are there any amendments, Mr. Vice Chair?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I do have one quick amendment. On line 74, in front of the word damages, I amend that we include the language for plaintiffs filing under this paragraph, comma, and then the sentence would go on, damages against such entity may be awarded, and then to strike under this paragraph. And I just think that it's a minor tweak that creates a tad bit more clarity. So again, before the word damages, insert for plaintiffs filing under this paragraph, comma, and then strike under this paragraph later on in the sentence.
All right, so it would read, for plaintiffs filing under this paragraph, damages against such entity may be awarded only if the plaintiff, et cetera. Is that correct?
That's right.
Counselor, did you get that? Questions? Counselor, any questions or concerns on that structurally? Questions for the author of the amendment, Mr. Gravely?
Mr. Chairman, just to make sure, we're on LC 29784S.
No, we're on 8.2.
82.
We're on 8.2S. Just make sure that's clear for everybody. We're on 7982S. Okay.
Yeah, I don't have that one.
Do you want mine? Okay. On the Reeves Amendment, all in favor say aye.
Aye.
Opposed? The ayes have it, and the motion's adopted. Are there any further amendments? Are there any further amendments? Seeing none, all in favor of the underlying motion of do pass by substitute of House Bill 605, LC 297982S, as amended, including the Reeves Amendment. All in favor say aye.
Aye.
Opposed? The ayes have it, and the motion's adopted. Thank you, and we are adjourned.